Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And hey, if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And alright guys, well, I'm glad you all enjoyed the Costa Concordia series. That was a ton of fun to make and it was a lot of work and a lot of research to put that whole video together. So it really means a lot that you guys enjoyed the video. I know I enjoyed making it. But for this episode, I thought we would scoot on back to Titanic for a little bit here. And in case you all are wondering, when is the Halifax explosion video coming? Do not worry, I'm going to start on it next week. So I would probably say that video will come out probably Friday of next week. So we'll see. But yeah, for this episode, we are going to head on back to Titanic and talk about one of the most talked about topics in the entire story of the Titanic. And that is, why did the Titanic actually hit an iceberg? Now, there's a lot of theories and a lot of speculations about this, and a lot of conspiracy theories as well. But you know what? I thought for this episode, I would try to set the record straight and actually go over the evidence and try to figure out once and for all what caused the RMS Titanic to collide with that iceberg on that cold night on April 14th, 1912. Before we talk about my theory as to why the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg that night, let's first talk about some of the other more common theories that people seem to believe about why this ship hit the berg and see if there's any truth to them. The first theory we are going to discuss is the whole idea that the Titanic was just traveling too fast through a known ice field that night. The second theory we're going to talk about is the captain. A lot of people think it was his fault that the ship struck the iceberg. They think he was being negligent in his duties. They think he was trying to push the Titanic to beat a speed record, and that's why it hit. They think he was drunk on duty, so we're going to talk about that. And the third and final thing we're going to talk about is this whole idea that the big reason the Titanic struck the iceberg was because the lookouts in the Titanic's crow's nest didn't have access to binoculars that night. We're going to discuss this and see if there's any truth to this statement as well. So yeah, let's talk about these three theories first and see if any of them have any basis in reality. Okay, so the first theory I want to talk about here is the whole idea that the Titanic was just traveling way too fast through a known ice field the night she sank. And this is the reason as to why she struck the iceberg. And while it is true that the Titanic was cruising along at roughly 21, 22 knots that night, very close to the Titanic's top speed, you have to understand why. And it's not the whole conspiracy theory that people seem to believe that the crew just thought the Titanic was unsinkable, so icebergs didn't matter. That wasn't the case at all. The crew on board the Titanic were very wary of icebergs, and nobody on the ship really believed that the Titanic was unsinkable. That's something that came much later after the sinking, that whole thing got spread around. So the official statement from the White Star Line was the Titanic was not unsinkable. It was just as unsinkable as we knew how to make a ship. So as far as the public is concerned, all that means is that the Titanic is just a very safe vessel. It's not like the public had this religious faith in the ship or something. That wasn't the case at all. So in the case of that night, the Titanic was cruising along at roughly 21, 22 knots near the ship's top speed. And from the crew's perspective, that night seemed like it was a perfectly clear evening. From the crew on the bridge of the Titanic's perspective, it looked like they could see miles and miles off into the distance. They thought that they had such good visibility that night that if there were any icebergs sighted, they would be able to see it at least 30 minutes before the Titanic actually came up on it and it would pose a risk to the ship. So because of this, they didn't think they had to slow down. And honestly, I agree with them. If I saw the conditions that night and I saw that there's so much visibility, the ocean is so calm, the night is so clear that we would have time to see the icebergs before they pose a risk to the ship, why not continue on at full speed or near full speed? And then if you start to see bergs and you start to see danger a half hour off in the distance, then slow down and then try to plan what you need to do from there on. That was the big reason as to why the Titanic was cruising along at near top speed during the night that she struck the iceberg. Now let's tackle the second reason why most people seem to think that the Titanic struck the iceberg. And that reason is, it was all the captain's fault. If you believe some of these people, they would really have you think that the captain was drunk on duty during the night of the impact. He was trying to push the Titanic to set a speed record. He didn't take the iceberg warning seriously, so he just continued on at near full speed regardless. So let's talk about this and see if there is any truth to these claims. All right, so let's state the obvious first. No, the captain was not drunk on duty the night the Titanic went down. I don't know how that conspiracy started getting passed around, but there is no merit of truth to that whatsoever. The truth is, Captain Smith never drunk when he was at sea on any vessel, period. He was honestly too good of a captain and too good of an officer to do anything like that. He would not do anything that could compromise his judgment and have that potentially lead to some kind of a disaster on his vessel. He would not do that. You have to remember, Captain Smith was no Captain Scatino, so. Number 2, the Titanic was not going for any kind of speed record the night she hit the iceberg. This has been something that's been passed around since the disaster, but the truth is that the Titanic, if the Titanic had been going for a speed record, all of the Titanic's boiler rooms would have been lit up the night of the impact. So you see, the Titanic had 6 boiler rooms. Boiler room 6 was at the front, boiler room 1 was in the back. And of those boiler rooms, only boiler rooms 6 through 2 were lit up. Boiler room 1 was never turned on. You see, the truth is the Titanic was making such good time that the crew saw no reason to turn on boiler room number 1. And because the Titanic was making good time, if they had turned on boiler room number 1, then maybe there would be some merit to the whole idea of them going for a speed record. But they never did that, so that's proof that the Titanic was not going for a speed record. And then number 3 was that the captain never took his duties seriously and, didn't take the iceberg warning seriously. Well, that's not true as well. You see, that day, when he received all of those ice warnings, he had actually diverted the Titanic a little bit further south in an attempt to miss all of these icebergs. So in his mind, he did a lot of things he could in order to protect his ship. And then before he retired that evening, he actually told all of the bridge officers on board the Titanic to keep a sharp eye out for anything that would pose a danger to the ship. And you have to remember, as discussed earlier, the weather was clear and calm that night. So honestly, he did everything he could, and he was a very good and honorable captain. And honestly, he was a really good choice to be on board the RMS Titanic during the ship's maiden voyage. Now let's talk about this whole idea that it was the lookouts in the Titanic's crow's nest fault for not seeing the iceberg because they did not have binoculars that night. For those of you who don't know, the binoculars on board the Titanic were actually locked inside of a case, and they never got the key for them, so these binoculars remained locked up and were never used. So, is this the reason as to why the Titanic struck the iceberg that night? Well, I can answer this question quickly. No, I do not believe binoculars were a reason as to why the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg that night. Even if the lookouts had binoculars that night, I highly doubt they would have been using them. So here are my reasons. If the Titanic would have struck the iceberg during the daytime and the lookouts didn't see it, then yes, I would say the binoculars probably would have played a role, and if they did have them, then the ship wouldn't have hit the berg, because during the daytime, binoculars can really help you spot things that are way off in the distance. However, that's not always the case at nighttime, especially the night that the Titanic went down, because there was no moon that night, so there wouldn't be a lot of light reflecting off of the berg anyway. You see, at night on a ship, if you're a lookout in a crow's nest, the best way to spot an iceberg is to notice the black outline of the berg against the horizon and the stars. That's the best way to see it, because you got to remember, it's really dark out there, and that's basically how you spot icebergs. Now, if there would have been a moon that night, maybe binoculars would have been helpful, because that could have helped them spot the shimmering light of the moon off of that of the iceberg. But there was no moon that night. So honestly, they didn't want to be looking through these very narrow eyepieces trying to spot the black outline of a berg through a very narrow eyepiece, because honestly, that severely limits your view. The best way to spot an iceberg in the conditions that they were facing that night is to have just, your bare eyes just looking out at the horizon and try to spot the outline of the iceberg. So I hope I explained that clearly, because this is kind of hard to explain. But yeah, bottom line, I do not think that the lack of binoculars played any role whatsoever in the sinking of the Titanic. Alright, so now that we've explained why all those other theories that try to explain why the Titanic struck the iceberg don't make sense, now let's talk about the theory that I believe best explains why the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg on that cold night in April 1912. Honestly, I think it was just bad weather. I think bad weather was the reason that the Titanic struck the iceberg that night. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait a minute, didn't you just say earlier that the weather that night was clear and calm? How could it possibly be bad weather? How could that be the reason that the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg that night? Well, let me explain. You see, throughout the entire voyage of the Titanic, the ship had been experiencing remarkably good weather. And I'm not just referring to ocean conditions, I'm also referring to the temperature outside. Throughout the entire voyage, the temperature around the ship had been roughly 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. However, all that changed on the evening of April the 14th, 1912. As the sun was beginning to set, the crew on board the ship noticed a massive temperature drop, with the temperature plummeting to below freezing in as little as 1 to 2 hours. So, what caused this massive shift in temperature on this particular evening? Well, the answer to this question is actually pretty simple. You see, throughout the entire voyage of the Titanic, the ship had been sailing in the relatively warm waters of the Gulf Stream. This is why the temperature around the ship was so good. However, on the evening of April the 14th, the Titanic left the waters of the Gulf Stream and sailed into the freezing waters of the Labrador Current. Now, the Labrador Current is a strong current system that actually brings the freezing water of the north down to the south. And this same current is also responsible for bringing the icebergs of the north down to the south. And when the Titanic left the warm waters of the Gulf Stream and sailed into the Labrador Current, this is the reason why everybody on board the ship experienced a sudden drop in temperature. So essentially what happened? When the Titanic left the relatively warm waters of the Gulf Stream and sailed into the freezing cold water of the Labrador Current, this created a massive air, temperature, and pressure shift around the entire Titanic. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, you see, as the Titanic was sailing through the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, you've got relatively warm water the ship is sailing through, relatively warm air above the ship. Makes sense. Now, when the Titanic sailed into the freezing cold waters of the Labrador Current, this created a really weird, different temperature barrier around the ship, the air, and the water around it. So essentially, when the ship entered the cold Labrador Current waters, you've got freezing cold water below the ship. And then the air immediately above and around the Titanic was also starting to drop in temperature. This is why the passengers and crew noticed the huge temperature drop after the Titanic entered the Labrador Current. However, above that, you still have a layer of relatively warm air. So you've got warm air, cold air, freezing water. And this weird shift in air pressure, air temperature, and all this stuff is what I'm referring to when I say that the Titanic experienced bad weather on the night she sank. You see, all of this weird air temperature pressure differences created a very rare weather phenomenon known as a cold water mirage. So essentially what happens in this phenomenon, due to all the weird air, temperature, and pressure differences, the light molecules that bounce off the object that you are observing as they travel to you, these light molecules actually get distorted due to all the weird air, temperature, and pressure differences. So if you're somewhere and it's during the daytime and you're observing a ship that's in the middle of one of these mirage effects, basically what it does is it imposes another image of the vessel on top of it. As you can see from this picture right here, you're observing a freighter that looks like there's another freighter sailing upside down directly on top of it. And this is due to the weird atmospheric pressure differences generated by a cold water mirage. Now, another effect that a cold water mirage can do is it can actually bend light rays to allow you to be able to see an object off in the distance that you normally wouldn't be able to see. So essentially what this does is it bends the light rays around the curvature of the Earth to basically extend the horizon so you can actually see further than you normally would. However, this comes at a cost. Now, this whole process of seeing beyond the horizon, what you're actually looking at is something called a false horizon that is generated by the cold water mirage. The actual horizon is actually hidden below the false horizon, meaning you can't see it because you're watching and observing the false horizon, which is showing you the things that are further away. So what that means is any object that is inside the actual horizon will be invisible to you until you are right up on it. This is one big theory as to why the Titanic struck the iceberg that night. They believe that the Titanic sailed into a cold water mirage and that the actual iceberg was hidden in the real horizon, while the crew on board the Titanic were observing the false horizon, which showed clear waters as far as the eye can see. Now, this phenomenon is actually pretty easy to observe during the day. Look at this picture right here. It appears that you are seeing a giant freighter floating in mid-air. And this photo looks photoshopped, doesn't it? Well, it's not. What you are seeing is the light molecules and particles being reflected and bounced off the weird atmospheric phenomenon of a cold water mirage, making it appear like this freighter is floating in mid-air, meaning you can't really see what's at the surface level below the false horizon. This photo is another clear example of a cold water mirage false horizon. you can clearly see that there's a really weird weather phenomenon going on. Well, what you're seeing is actual water and ice that is beyond the horizon that is being reflected back to the observer due to the weird atmospheric pressure differences carrying the light molecules around the curvature of the Earth and back to the observer. This is the exact same phenomenon that is most likely occurring on board the RMS Titanic on the evening of April the 14th, 1912. Now, unfortunately for the RMS Titanic, when it began to sail into the area that was affected by this mirage effect and they began to experience all the weird weather phenomenon, atmospheric phenomenon, it was nighttime. So that meant there was very little light around to reveal the fact that they were experiencing a cold water mirage effect. And what makes it even worse is the fact that there was no moon. So there's even less light to show that there's a weird mirage effect going on. And we're pretty sure there was a mirage effect because several of the passengers on board the Titanic, as the ship was sailing along, noted that the stars looked unusually large and that there were a lot more stars out that night than usual. And this is due to the weird mirage effect, making objects that are further away appear larger and closer than they really are. They said that there were so many stars out that night. So, as far as the bridge crew was concerned, as the Titanic was sailing along, they also noted the strangely good visibility, because from their perspective, it looked like they could see much further out than normal, due to the weird curvature of the light particles being bent by the mirage effect. However, what the crew on the bridge didn't realize is that now they have a huge blind spot right in front of them because they're observing the false horizon, while the iceberg is hiding in the real horizon that is obscured by the mirage effect. And honestly, this is really what I think sunk the Titanic. I think that this is why the Titanic struck the iceberg that night. I really believe that the iceberg was hidden by this mirage effect, and that by the time they spotted the berg come out of the haze of the mirage, they were so close to it that they didn't have time to react. I mean, honestly, this makes the most sense because, they couldn't tell there was a mirage going on. They sail into the cold waters of the Labrador Current from the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, so the air pressure differences would make sense. And honestly, this theory makes the most sense against all the other theories that I've heard and talked about today in this video, and this is what I truly believe happened to the Titanic that caused it to hit the iceberg that night. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And listen, this whole mirage stuff, this is stuff that I never even learned about before until I began studying the Titanic disaster. And honestly, it really does make the most sense because the people on board the Titanic and other vessels, they knew what they were doing, and this makes a lot more sense to me than any of those other theories that just say, oh, they were being careless, because come on, guys. These guys are trained men. They know what they're doing. They've been at sea a long time. They know how to take care of a vessel. Them being caught off guard by a weird weather phenomenon makes way more sense than any of the other stuff that we've talked about in this video. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and be sure to hit that like button. Please subscribe if you're new here. And yeah, guys, just keep doing what you do. You guys are awesome. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody. Special thanks to my very first captain level Patreon supporter, John Shepard. Thank you so much for all the support, man.